Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Alan Lusk and I serve on the board at Friends of Hagerman. And I wanted to welcome everyone to our program today for Second Saturday. I've posted a note in the chat to our new website if you haven't checked that out. And if you go out to the website under About, you can join us as a member and help support all the activities that we've got going on at Hagerman. And I think Wayne Myers is on the call today. And I was going to let Wayne have the honors of introducing our speaker, Peter Schulze, today. So, Wayne.
Thank you, Alan. Pete Schulze is a colleague of mine at Austin College, member of the biology department, but he is also the director of the Austin College Environmental Studies program, and so is very well equipped for this talk today. Pete.
Thanks, Wayne. Thank you all. Thank Alan, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join the group again. It's an honor. Partly because I've been focused on a particular topic, and partly because I thought it might be engaging. I hope so. Do something a little different than normally. I've given kind of a PowerPoint talk, sort of, when I've talked to this group. But I'm finishing a book, and I feel kind of obnoxious saying that, but it's a fact. And I've been working on it a long time. I didn't set out to write a book, but I have been frustrated by a subject ever since I was kind of late in graduate school, which is quite a long time ago now. And the subject is, if we've got environmental problems and so many people know it, why don't we just fix them? And so that's never been the focus of my research or anything. It's just something that's been in my mind, and as I teach courses and stuff. And so I thought, oh, and I have some pretty specific ideas about this. And I bet as soon as I say that, why don't we just fix the environmental problems? Anybody who comes to one of these Hagerman sessions has already thought of a few reasons. And that's great. But what I thought I would do is I want to show you a couple of slides to just kind of capture the question that I'm talking about here, or try to. And then I thought we would have, rather than a presentation, if it's okay with you and the audience, hopefully it'll be okay with some of you, a little more of a discussion. I'm curious to see why you think we don't just solve environmental problems. And Alan and I have talked about this some, and I want to make a preface, which is that I think when that subject is raised, it can sound like it's immediately a political topic, but I'm not going to try to constrain what other people talk about. I'll leave that up to Alan, but if you want to, Alan, but I don't see this as primarily political. There's certainly political elements, but I see it as a much broader and more complex, not that that wouldn't be complex enough, subject. So let me just show a couple of slides here to try to get the idea across about what I'm getting at. And you can see the New York Times headline there, correct, Alan?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, very good. Oh, and then let me before we get going, let's say, Alan, maybe you want to edit what I'm going to say here. Feel free to correct me. But once I show you a few slides, if you have a suggestion or a comment or a response to somebody else's comment, you can either put your hand up like that. But while the slides are on, I can't see everybody at once, even your name. And so I wouldn't even necessarily know your hand is up. Or you can use the little raise hand function that's at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Or you can put something in the chat, and Alan's going to monitor the chat. And if there's a question or a comment in the chat, then Alan, thank you, Alan, will notice. And one way or another, get you involved in the discussion. Okay, I'm going to move my screen around a little bit, and I may advance a slide by mistake. So given that this is a presentation with the Hagerman group, and there's a lot of great stuff about birds at Hagerman, but from a little broader context, there's some problems for birds, and you may have remember that a couple of years ago, an article came out where they'd estimated the decline in the abundance of birds in general in the country over the last while, and it's quite striking. Massive quantity of birds. And Alan and I were talking just yesterday, and we both were, okay, I've got a remote keyboard here, and I've just screwed something up. Hold on a second. I'm gonna advance a slide. There we go. We were reminding each other of how car windshields are not like they used to be, that when we were young, if you drove for a while in the summer, your windshield consistently got covered with insects, which wasn't a good thing, killing the insects, but it was a good thing, I suppose, that the insects, okay, I'm not going to say I suppose, the insects were there. But now you can drive for a long way sometimes and very few bugs on the windshield. And some of you may know there's some reports have come out of suggesting that there are widespread insect declines. There's obviously a lot of other research and news reporting about particular insects like monarchs and bees, but it's hard to confirm that there's widespread insect decline for reasons we discuss if people want to. But the fact is, when you drive along, you got to go a long way before a windshield looks like this anymore. And so, suggests there's a problem with the insects. Well, darn it. I should have turned off. Sorry, here we go. So what I want to ask you to think about is, why don't we just fix environmental problems? Let me show you a few different pictures that are all intended to suggest that there are environmental problems. I've mangled my knees over the years, and so I ride a bicycle for the sake of my knees, and I take my camera because then my phone, and then I have an excuse to stop and rest. And so this is just a picture from outside between Sherman and Hagerman. Pretty remarkable little spot there. These are widely known data about the cod fishery off of Newfoundland. It's arguable, I think, that people came to North America from Europe for the cod, and the cod fishery ramped up and up and up and through the early part of the 20th century, and then faster as the cod fishing technology got better, and then bam. And it's still pretty much zeroed out because of not recovering from the depletion. This is the familiar to many people, I suspect, graph of carbon dioxide concentrations that they measure in Hawaii, often called the Keeling curve. And that goes from coincidentally, basically exactly when I was born, a couple months before I was born, until the present. And it doesn't look like a whole lot of startling impact on it. Just seems to keep chugging along. The up and down, you may have heard, is an annual cycle where when it's warm in the northern hemisphere where there's a lot of land, the plants reduce the carbon dioxide concentration a little bit. And then when there's not nearly as much land in the southern hemisphere, and then when it's cold in the northern hemisphere, those plants respire but don't photosynthesize much, and a little carbon dioxide gets given off. This in New Mexico. This is the highway side of the road. I'm assuming you can see my cursor. Somebody tell me if you can't see my cursor. This is the non-highway side of the road. This in Greece. To me, there's a lot of similarity between these two photos, except for the remarkable ruins here. Plato wrote this about 2,500 years ago. So 2,500 years ago, Plato had realized there were problems with land use. And I can ride my bicycle around Sherman and see the same problems with land use. And those of you that have read a lot of sort of Aldo Leopold or George Perkins Marsh or Rachel Carson or others know that there have been warnings about these kinds of things for some time now. Not to be simplistic, but it strikes me when one sees photographs of conflict zones, there often aren't very many plants in the background. So those slides are intended as a reminder that there are some environmental problems. Some of the environmental problems have been around a very long time. Others, like climate change, have only been recognized more recently. I think a case can be made that millions, if not billions, of people in the world understand that these situations, we're on the only planet that's known to support life anywhere, and these things are reducing the planet's life support potential. So if we're so smart, why don't we just fix it? And so that's the question that I wanted to pose. I've got this slide like this for now because I've got some things written behind there. Not lengthy explanations, but just some categories sort of. But at this point, I'm curious whether either people have any questions of anything I've said that needs clarifying, or what thoughts you have about why we just don't solve. And there are a lot of reasons. It's not, I'm not going to suggest there's one reason, and if we just take care of that, everything be fine. But why it is that humans, smart as they are, seem to have so much difficulty, and we have solved some problems. We can talk about that too if you like, but or improve some problems. But why is it that these things persist? So I'm going to pause there, and I teach enough classes to know to be patient at this point, because at the beginning of a discussion, sometimes it requires a little patience on the part of the person organizing the discussion.
And feel free to unmute yourself and jump in if you'd like to make a comment or elaborate on the points that Pete's making.
Absolutely. I'm inclined, Alan, for the moment to stop sharing the screen, if that's okay, and I'll put it back on later if there's a reason to. I think, is that okay with you?
Sure.
I could call on people, you know, but it's not a class, so I'm just.
I'd like to comment.
Please.
I've written down about 5 things.
All right.
If you want to hear them.
I told you you'd have someone occur to you immediately. Well, I mean, yes, I would like to hear them.
Okay. Urban growth, wind farms, solar farms, pesticide, and overgrazing. I can't get my chat to work. I'm sorry.
No problem. So are these reasons we don't solve problems, or these causes of problems?
Well,
or something else?
I think it's a combination. Like urban growth is the reason we can't solve it. And just development, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But most of them are causes, probably not the reason we don't fix them, but I think it's just population. We can't fix it.
Okay. I'm not going to argue with any of these. I'm inclined to collect other comments or see what other people have to say. If there are other comments.
Hello, this is Sherry Preston.
Hi, Sherry.
I think in these years of the Great Divide, politics impacts our ability to solve our environmental problems. I think there's denial or hesitation with a lot of people regarding what the state of our environment is. And I think that is a huge problem with attacking what we've got going on here. We're always fighting about, well, there's no climate change. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. More fossil fuel, more this, more that. And I think we're so impotent with the divide that we can't get anything done. We need to unite and fix this before it's too late.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm resisting the temptation for me to respond to your comments for now, because I know that I can go on and then there won't be an opportunity for other people to weigh in. And so don't think, nobody should think that because I'm not responding specifically or seconding what you've said, it doesn't mean I don't think it's a great, not who cares what I think in particular, but don't think it's an important point. But I am inclined. Go ahead.
Peter, my name is Balaji.
Balaji.
Yeah. And what I think is most of the people, large parts of the population, still continue to get what they want. Like they still have access to good food, water, basic needs, shelter, resources. Not many are impacted by these environmental concerns today. So they haven't woken up to the problems yet. A related point to what was said previously, but they haven't felt the impact yet. So maybe they are not ready to tackle the problem yet.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Pam White. I'm sharing the computer with Duffy. I think it's a lot of misinformation, and I don't want to use that in the political term, but an example would be, you know, all the urban and suburban lawns that we have this perception now that you have to have a neatly mowed yard with no weeds in it, no leaves anywhere on your property if it's in the flower beds. And so that's just a perception that we've kind of been led to an expectation with our HOAs, even in our own personal perception. It was kind of like 50, 60 years ago, everybody smoked. You know, I mean, it was just very common. People smoked in theaters, people smoked. And so I think it's still this lack of acknowledgement that those things are not healthy, or those things are not the way to go, but we still have it in our head that that's the perfect lawn, that's the perfect median, that's the, you know, that's what we need to be doing. And so that's kind of one of the thoughts I had.
Thank you, Pam. I got to interject with something here because it just made me go, wow. My wife and I have a group of friends that during the pandemic, we kind of eat dinner outside in one of them's backyard, even through the winter, in the cold on occasion. And I couldn't believe this, but somebody had a wet spot in their yard and they had some of the crayfish or crawdad towers from the terrestrial crayfish that occurs around here. And about half the people at this little dinner are biologists, and not this person. And they said how they were putting mothballs down to get rid of the crayfish out of their yard. I was like, oh no, you can't, what do you, But it was one of those close friends things where it wasn't quite the time to go crazy, but I think we brought it up a little more subtly later. Other thoughts? This
is Laurie Shepard. It may be cynical of me, but the phrase that keeps running through my mind is follow the money.
Follow the money?
Many of the things that are extending or exacerbating the problem are making some people money. And I just think that's an impediment to all of us.
Other thoughts?
Peter, one more thing. People are focused on short-term, life. Like they're focused on what to do today, tomorrow, and they don't think beyond. Maybe then they don't realize what's in the store for future. So they just take care of present, and that's it.
I think these are all elements, and we got anything else?
Education. This is Beverly Pritchard. Education.
You mean people just don't know, right?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? Yeah.
And if from starting in school, you know,
Right.
not starting now, but for us older people.
Wayne, do you ever ask students what the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere is?
No.
There's not necessarily a reason for it too in Wayne's classes, but we teach the same groups of students, and I'll occasionally, as a means of talking to them about what happened to get covered in their education when they were younger and what didn't. I'll ask them about the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere. And I happen to think it's something that people take for granted, and we can probably kind of get away with taking it for granted for now. Maybe not the concentration of other things, but everybody knows oxygen comes from plants. Everybody knows they need to breathe. But it'll astonish me that most college students have never been in a conversation in a science class about, they've heard something about plants give off oxygen and animals take up oxygen, and they don't necessarily realize plants take up oxygen too, but it's just that it's 20%, and then it would really matter if it was just a little different than 20%. Is usually they've never heard it. And I mentioned that here because Beverly mentioned education and the content of education changes slowly. Yeah. Other thoughts? So I've heard things about the size of the population, long-term versus short-term, vested interest, a variety of particular kinds of activities. Go ahead.
Hello, I had a question.
Sure.
Question, I guess.
Yeah.
Your question is, why don't we solve this? I think a lot of the comments have been, why don't we acknowledge it? But once you get to solutions, that itself is a huge set of issues. Different countries disagree. Different people at different levels of economic development disagree. When to do something is a matter of disagreement. So it's complex all the way down.
Yep, I agree. I in fact, I said fix. I've obviously had reviewers of the draft that I'm finishing up, and I referred to solutions as an ideal, not as naive on my part, I don't think. But one reviewer just got all over that. Like, you can't refer to solutions. You're not going to solve these things. You make progress on them, but they're not going to go away completely. And I don't really like to look at it that way, but they were looking at it from a complex problem perspective. And, is it really realistic to talk about, okay, we solved that, let's move on to the next thing. I agree. Let's see, that was Peter. Yeah.
Margaret keeps trying to jump in here, so go ahead, Margaret.
Sorry, yeah. And I hate to say it, some people just don't care. If you look at trash, like in our area, Hagerman trash pickup, good gosh, people are always throwing waste out. If you go out in the country, anywhere in Grayson County, garbage is a problem. There's so many people, there's so much waste. The oceans are full of plastic trash.
Have y'all ever had John Ockles talk to your group? That might be, John Ockles is a local gentleman. He's on the external advisory board of our environmental studies program at the college. And he runs something called the Texas Illegal Dumping Resource Center. I have his contact information, everything, Alan or Wayne or anybody else. It would be a different sort of talk, but I've actually nominated him for one of these Texas state awards for environmental excellence. I think it's possible that he's done more for environmental improvement in Texas than anybody else. That's not a criticism of anybody else. There could certainly be people I don't know about, but he's fascinating, and he goes around the state educating county commissioners, peace officers, prosecutors, code enforcement officers about the existing state laws about basically illegal dumping. But he's got a whole bunch of courses he's developed, and I don't know how many miles he puts on his cars, and it's about those kind of things, and that's real interesting. And it's interesting how it varies around the country. I don't run anymore, but because my knees, but my knees are basically fine, but running isn't a great thing for him. But I took a run up in Michigan in an area that I know, which is a very pretty area where there's people up there understand how the economy depends on it being pretty. But I took a run that was 6 miles, and I decided I was going to count the litter that I saw. And at that speed, you can, if they're not too much, you can count it. And in 6 miles, I saw 6 pieces of litter, including cigarette butts. It varies, in different parts of the world. It's really different. I was following somebody in the car the other day, and person in the passenger seat just chucked something out the window. What? Other thoughts?
surprised Mike Keck hadn't chimed in here.
But this is Pam again, Pam White again.
Sure.
You were talking about trash. I remember, I don't know whether it was 30 or, and Margaret was talking about trash, 30 or 40 years ago, there used to be a big promotional from Texas, don't mess with Texas. And you'd see the signs along the highways and, you know, you'd see advertisements and stuff. And I think that made a difference. And I haven't seen those for a long, long, long time. And I agree. Now people seem to be, there seems to be more trash, you know,
Does it seem worse?
Well, I don't know. That's my perception. I could be totally wrong. You know how it is when you, sometimes your perceptions are not actually factual,
Sure.
but I just think where did all that promotion go? Where did all that education go? Did we think we reached our 100%, you know, knowledge about trash? And so now Texas doesn't have to do that anymore, where you have multiple generations coming up that need to be reminded and taught that.
I moved with my family, my wife and I and our one son at the time too now, but moved here in the mid 90s, and we saw the signs. I thought it was just some Texas bravado thing. I thought it was, I didn't realize it. I lived here for a long time before I realized it was referring to trash. But then I also thought there was a restaurant called Chick-fil-A, and I couldn't figure that out either. Chick-fil-A. Didn't occur to me it was pronounced Chick-fil-A. Yeah. Does anybody have any thoughts about anybody else's comments or want to add to them? Or I'll read back what I heard. It won't be, it'll be in the order I heard it, not in reorganized or anything like that. But we heard urban growth, development, population, politics. A lot of people have what they really need, and these are long-term problems, and they're focused on short-term issues, misunderstanding or misinformation, delays in learning about things, other comments about following the money, education, and just not really caring, and challenges of, if you do want to try to solve the problem, how do you actually do it and get people to agree on doing it? It's I think you're getting a long way toward writing my book draft for me, which I appreciate. I was curious to see if something would come up that, and this is a little, I told Alan, a little selfish on my part. I was curious to see if something come up that I hadn't really gotten in the mix. Are there other, let's see, I see a chat here. Yep. Mike, you go by Michael. I see that. Yeah, I agree. So by the way, what I'm working on, I don't see it as original at all. I see it as organizing stuff that I've just never seen organized this way before. Alan, I'm inclined to maybe show one slide that has some pieces of, sort of has the guts of the kind of categories of reasons that occur to me. And then if people want, I can show that in more detail or not.
Go for it.
And go from there. But I want to encourage people, if you have a thought or a comment, what do we have until about a little before 11? Is that the normal? What's your normal time? I should have meant to ask this before, but you go.
Yeah, 11-ish is fine.
Okay. All righty. So let me see. I'm going to share the screen again. And then I want to get rid of this gray thing. So I've got to get out of that format of the PowerPoint and get rid of the gray thing. And I may goof up a little bit here. Delete, please. Delete. If I turn off Zoom or something, I'll apologize and try to find you again. There we go. So the way I've been thinking about this stuff is, I think there's categories and categories within categories. And there's, for lack of a better term, and boy, if somebody has a better term, please let me know. But I think there's some obstacles to fixing or problems or making environmental progress. And I want to emphasize, I think we do make environmental progress sometimes, but maybe not fast enough, or not lately, or not as much as we would like, many of us. I don't mean to presume what you think, but the things that I think of as ultimate obstacles, And things I think of as proximate or sort of whoops, I guess it doesn't need to say obstacles, proximate obstacles. And here, these have to do with, by ability, I mean, limits on our ability to predict the future and understand complex systems. And priorities is values, are like some of you made comments about people don't care. If when it comes to environmental problems, if people are not prioritizing that, then the obstacles that come up over here don't become relevant yet, because it's just not, it's not a focus of interest and nobody's doing anything about it. When it comes to proximate obstacles, in other words, by this I mean, and here again, I'm not real satisfied with these two terms. Wayne will know how they're used in anatomy and they're used in evolutionary biology, but they're used in some other fields to mean sort of close up and deeper, or close up and far away, but I don't know that they're used widely enough to be well understood for my purpose. By proximate, I mean, if, okay, Sherman quit curbside recycling about a year ago. I wasn't happy with that decision. It wasn't because people couldn't predict the future enough to figure out that there were limits on non-renewable resources. So it wasn't, they didn't quit because of this. They might have quit because people didn't prioritize recycling enough, but that wasn't the argument anybody gave. I was at the city council meeting and they didn't say, no city council member or staff person said, I don't care about the environment. In fact, anybody preparing to say why they were voting to quit the curbside recycling would have said how much they care about the environment, how important the subject is, how they would like everybody to recycle, but, and then the but was something over here. And so I think there are three categories here, which have to do with detecting problems and understanding that there's a problem. And we can talk about those if people would like. And then there's I can show you a list with several things in each of these categories. And then there's deciding to respond versus, okay, you've detected a problem, or at least some people have detected a problem or think they've detected a problem and think they understand the reason for it. But the group, whether it's a small group or whether it's a group of people running a ranch or whether it's a town or whether it's the world, haven't decided to respond, or some have, but it hasn't been enough to actually generate a response. And then there's respond, but the response might not be effective. So this is how I've been looking at these things, and I can make a different display that will flesh out the ones on the right. My book draft is really about the stuff on the right, but these are underlying. But there's a lot of discussion of this. There's a lot of, this is an excuse I'm giving you now, but there are a lot of books out there that comment on about worldviews and political philosophies and things that deprioritize the environment. And so,
I'll interject in here. What was the specific reason that Sherman stopped having the recycling? Well,
there's the stated reason, and then there's what I think is the reason. And so this is a particular subject which it's political, not in the sense of partisan, but political in the sense of people coming down to different conclusions. For me to talk about this is, I'm going to tell you what I think. The ostensibly, the reason was that people were contaminating the recycling too much. I think that the listening to the discussion that went on and the arguments that were made, that really it was a short-term budget issue, and somebody figured out a way to make the short-term budget look better if they quit recycling. Sherman had saved one of our students, one of Wayne's and my students got Sherman recycling back a while back by working with the high school geography teacher and running a survey around the town, and found that people wanted recycling, and the city council went for it some time ago. I'm trying to, Tom Mayer, does anybody from Sherman remember the name? He was a very nice guy. It was maybe 15 or so years ago. Anyhow, you may know, people may know that a few years ago, China made tighter restrictions on what material they would take that was unsorted recyclables, or recyclables that were contaminated. and they limited the amount of contamination. And some American municipal recycling systems had been getting away with not having to worry too much about contamination because they were still able to get this stuff taken and could at least, taking everything at face value, it was getting recycled. I don't have the expertise to know exactly what was going on when stuff got to China, but in theory, the contaminants were getting separated out, and the material was actually, a lot of material was getting recycled. What happened to the contaminants? Another question. The recycling facilities I'm familiar with do the sorting in the US, but that's not the only way things are done. Anyhow, so there was one problem for towns was all of a sudden the market for recyclables was fluctuating and they were getting lower amounts of money. And there's a common perception that among folks who would think that I'm just fiscal, very, what's going to pay off here? And we want to save the taxpayers money. And they look at, well, we should recycle if it'll make a profit, which is the wrong question. It's, even if you don't care about the environment, if the recycling costs less than landfilling, it saves money. So for many years, Sherman saved money on landfilling, but then the recycling prices dropped. And so for a little while, it wasn't cheaper than landfilling, is my understanding. I haven't seen the actual numbers, but that's what I heard in the discussion. But those prices fluctuate, and that's known. And for many years, it was like you'd been saving money doing something for a long time, and then for 1 year it was expensive. And so you did away with the infrastructure to do it, even though it was reasonable to expect. We can't predict the future with certainty, but it was reasonable to expect that it was going to start saving money, not to mention have environmental benefits in the future. And they decided to stop. But my understanding, and I could be wrong, but I listened to all these discussions and weighed in on these discussions. My understanding is they needed another trash truck. And if they didn't recycle, they're the same trucks. They wouldn't have to buy a trash truck. And so it stopped. Furthermore, and again, I'm just going to tell you what I heard. I saw some conflicting information where a staff member implied to the city council. The city council, as far as I know, made a reasonable decision based on the information they had. But the staff members showed a picture of some recycling. There was a Coke bottle in there. It had the little plastic label that's on the outside of a plastic bottle, and recyclers would prefer you pull those off. And it wasn't pulled off. And the person implied that level of recycling caused whole loads of Sherman's material to be rejected. In other words, the truck got to the recycling facility. The label on the Coke bottle caused a manager to go, nah, we're not taking that. And then the truck has to drive to a landfill, way more expensive. I talked to the manager of the recycling facility, and they said they daily sort stuff that's 60 or 70% contaminant material. So I didn't like the decision because I thought it was a short-term financial decision to save some money in the short term that was going to cost the city money in the long term and do the wrong thing environmentally. And I had questions about the information that was provided to the city council. I'm not blaming the city council members. They're acting on the information they had. And I could be wrong. I could misunderstand this. I realize we're being recorded. So, keep that in mind. But I just think it's short term. It's kidding me. If we can't recycle, come on.
Yeah, Michael also made a comment that Whitesboro stopped their recycling program about 2 months ago. So
yeah, a lot did, and it was temporarily costing money, but Sherman's lost the infrastructure now, and also, frankly, they one of Wayne's and my colleagues at Austin College used to be in charge of the Sherman recycling system, and did a lot, and then she was mayor and did a lot to that's Carrie Wacker, to get education out about how it was supposed to work. I know just from trying to get the college's recycling system to work that you have to constantly educate people about because new people move to town and that sort of thing, about what's recyclable and what's not. Sherman had a perverse incentive in the system, which they fixed, but didn't give it too long to correct things, which was when they started recycling, you got a recycling bin and a trash bin. And if you wanted another recycling bin, you could have that for free. If you want another trash bin, you had to pay for it. But in Texas, you have to get, a municipality has to get permission from the TCEQ to look in somebody's recycling bin. And so I didn't think people would be vandals to this degree, but apparently quite a lot of people in Sherman, rather than paying for a second trash bin, were just using their recycling bin as a trash bin. And so they weren't even trying to recycle right. They were just literally just intentionally throwing trash in the recycling bin. Like some of you said, they just didn't care. And frankly, I don't mean to, some people are in such dire circumstances that it's not reasonable to expect them to be caring as far as I'm concerned. But nevertheless, that was a mistake in the design. And I didn't catch on to, you know, I had some input to the initial design, and it didn't occur to me to say, wait. If you're going to charge for an extra trash bin, we got to have a way to inhibit contamination in the recycling bin, so people don't see that as a way to save on another trash bin. That one slipped my mind. I mean, one of my items in this list down here is that when you design a response, it might not work. There may be something you didn't think of in the response. And so what you try to do, you know, we're trying to restore that. Some of you have heard me talk about trying to restore the prairie at the Sneed property, and we're making some progress, but we can't say that it worked. It's made some progress. In a lot of ways, it hasn't yet. And that's because we don't know what we're doing well enough. I mean, to a large extent, it's because we don't know what we're doing well enough. Sorry if I went on a little longer. I'm going to say this is going to sound, I don't want to sound like a commercial endorsement, but if you live in Sherman and maybe in the surrounding towns now, if you want to recycle there's a drop off in Sherman, but it's kind of hard to use. And if you go out of your way to recycle and you don't bring a lot of stuff, you probably shouldn't have burned the gas. But there is a company now. We get curbside recycling from a company. It's the only one available, I think. So I don't think I'm endorsing one as opposed to competition, called Recyclops, like RE and then Cyclops, like a one-eyed thing. Recyclops. And if you look them up, recyclops.com, they take the college's recyclables. They take the recyclables from my house, some of my neighbors. They come around every 2 weeks. And it costs $12 a month, I think. So you have to pay for it, but you got to pay for things. So if is it okay for me to put a commercial thing in the chat? Anybody have an objection to that?
No, that's fine.
They have an interesting little business model. They're trying to. They have an interesting little business model of providing recycling services to, essentially, as I get it, towns that are a little far out from a big city to already have a municipal system available. Let's see, it does start and end with priorities. I agree. Is that Duffy or is that Pam?
Pam.
Yeah, it does. I think you're right about that. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, if you're going to Denton anyway, that's you've got that kind of option. I think it does start and end with values, and there's no doubt about it. And one of my challenges in my little draft, by the way, I mean, not that anybody should be interested, but when this comes out, it's going to be open access, so nobody has to pay for it. Is there's a lot there. I cite a lot of other books that discuss the role of values. If one that I use in my environmental policy class, an interesting book, students get a little tired of how many examples the author uses, but it's called A Green History of the World by somebody named Clive Ponting. And it's fascinating. In fact, the latest edition is called A New Green History of the World, because the first version was written a few decades ago and there was no chapter on climate change, but he basically added a chapter on climate change. It's a fascinating book. And it has sections in there on the role of worldviews. But I think it's also, aside from indigenous folks, there are a lot of different worldviews where there's still environmental problems. But I think I agree that values are at the roots of things, because if you prioritize something, like if somebody says it costs too much to do this, there are certain questions we don't treat that way, right? we see them as ethical issues. And so we don't say, well, how much does it cost? And I'll do it if it doesn't cost too much, because you think of it as, I'm not going to do that. And you can't pay me enough. So,
well, one thing in my mind around recycling is, in some sense, is using, plastic silverware and that kind of thing is, don't go there to begin with. How hard is it to wash some stainless steel instead of buying a box of plastic forks and spoons and knives?
Right. The year before I came to Austin College in the 90s, I had this cushy fellowship that I just literally was in the right place at the right time. And I worked with these engineers who do what they call industrial ecology. And this was back in the 90s, when I first heard that term, I kind of smirked and thought it was sort of greenwash or something. But these people were serious. Like I heard a Volvo engineer once give a talk, and he was dead serious about whether it was better for biodiversity if they made the hoods of their cars out of aluminum or steel. Not whether it was better for Volvo's profits or whether the car would get, be a better car, whether it was better for biodiversity. And he was getting into the mining of aluminum versus the recycling of steel and the mining of steel. The reason I mention that is because some other people that I had a chance to work with there tallied up the total amount of waste production in the country, Alan.
Yeah.
And divided by the population size. 2 different groups did it. And they came up with basically 300 pounds per person per day. Now, that's not trash. Trash is like 5 pounds a person a day. But they totaled up everything, from all the industrial processes, except hot water. If a utility plant warmed up water, which they do in the steam, in cooling towers, they didn't count the warming of the water. But at that time, it was 75% of the 300 pounds a day was from overburden from coal mining. But even if you say, okay, let's get rid of the coal mining, it was still 75 pounds of waste generated per person per day. Somewhere in my draft, I have a statistic on how much erosion there is, and it's the per pound of food grown. It's very scary. Well, it's 10:52, Alan. Are there, if I can show you a fleshed out list of these things, if anybody's interested. I don't have that set up as a PowerPoint, but I can show it from another document, just in case anybody has a question about 1 or 2 of them, or we can, I'll let you MC this, Alan. We can, that's a kind of nobody wants to go the 18 reasons and see a long list like that necessarily, but if after this discussion somebody would like to, I can display it. Or do people have other comments or questions? The hazard of this kind of thing is people have made a whole variety of great comments, most of which we haven't had a chance to actually flesh out, but I didn't hear anything I disagreed with.
Yeah, you might want to share it,
okay.
Particularly since we're recording this and people could go back and they may have follow-up discussion they would like to have.
To do this, I'm going to stop the share for a second and then mess with my computer to get the other file open. And what I'm going to just show you is table of contents of this draft. And if we try to see it all at the same time, it'll be too small. So I'm going to just show part of it at a time. Well, let's see if I can manipulate things well enough.
While you're manipulating, hi, this is Beverly Pritchard.
Hi,
I was wondering if you have the legality of things placed in your book.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Right.
People can't see the consequences of oxygen, but they can if there's a law,
That's right. Yeah.
And
sorry, go on.
Like city councils, they may not can recycle, or they vote against that, but then they will punish you if your yard isn't mowed and has a lot of weeds, and then charge you for it.
Yep.
That's just kind of what
Absolutely.
came to my mind.
So basically, the middle section of this table of contents, I know it can make people feel like they're going to get seasick if someone does this, is largely about laws. You know, essentially, what are laws? Laws, I don't like, nobody likes to be told what to do, all other things being equal, right? You know, you and I don't need a law against littering because we're not going to litter in the first place. And then you make a law because somebody's going to litter, and now, but the law will have some weird features to it that might or might not, you know, that everybody has to abide by it because somebody was, you know, because somebody wasn't going to behave in a way that was the group considered acceptable without the law. I see them as formalizing social agreements when the group is too big to do it without laws. And laws are a huge aspect. If the conversation had gone there, I would have shown you some slides. I put some slides in case, you know, we wanted to use them, about the things that have gotten a lot better. And so compared to when I was a kid, the air and the water in the US are a lot better. They're not fine, but they're a lot better. The concentration of lead in the atmosphere is way more than 95% reduced. The concentration of carbon monoxide in the atmosphere is more than 95% reduced. Rivers don't catch fire anymore. I mean, there was a time when in Chicago, it was a spectator activity to get your lawn chairs out and watch the river on fire. It's not like the river in Detroit for a while couldn't be detected as water in aerial photos that were using kind of automated, you know, what's the water, because there was so much stuff on top of the water, it didn't register to the wavelengths of the imaging systems as water. There was so much oil on it. So some things are better, and those are things where basically the country decided there was going to be a law about it. I agree. So anyhow, here's since this is recorded, the first, so this, you see, there's 3 sections basically: detecting and understanding problems, and these are basically sciencey things, except for the first one, which is we don't really have much of a system for looking out for problems that we didn't mean to make. And if you think about it, a lot of big ones, nobody meant to make all the birds decline. Not all, I don't mean to say all birds are declining, but nobody meant to make climate change, and nobody meant to make stratospheric ozone depletion, but these things got pretty far down the road before they got caught on to. And then these all have to do with aspects of science, but how limitations on, just give you one strange anecdote. We arrange internships for students in the summer, and a concern is, are they paid enough that the less well-off students can afford to do it? Because if they worked at Burger King, they'd make more money. But one of my son's college roommates had an internship with a investment bank in the summer and got paid $25,000. So, you know, that's a budget issue. Anyway, there's a lot of things here, and I guess some people, if they really, really want to see this, they can get the recording later and stop the thing. And then, sorry, there's a page break there, but then obstacles to responding. And these have to do with largely what come down to political issues. Like, people think there's more uncertainty than there is about the basic science. People say it's going to infringe upon their freedom, or the market will fix the problem on its own, or it's just going to cost too much, like recycling in Sherman. Or, yeah, we need to do it, but we got more pressing issues. Or this gets a lot of attention in the news now, but all kinds of things that make it so that we don't necessarily have majority rule. And then finally, if you protect a piece of, for example, an area of the world, it's not protected forever, it's protected for now. And you got to win that protection again, like the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge has, I think under the previous administration, they're heading in there, but there have been attempts to get access to the parts of the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge for oil leasing for 50 times, I think, that have been stopped in Congress. But only enough to get there once. It's like digging up the oil sands in Canada. You could protect against it. Didn't really happen, but you could. But if it gets dug up once, it's dug up. So you have to win every time. And then there's a section on obstacles to responding effectively that has to do with devising effective responses, compromises, like we can catch this many fish sustainably, but somebody wants to catch this many, so we compromise at this many, but that's more than what you can catch sustainably, so it's not going to work. Or if policy, you have a policy, but it breaks down. This is kind of like Sherman was recycling, but they weren't doing the things to make it keep working. And then things can just get swamped by other things that are going on. So for example, you might make less greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of economic activity, but if the size of the economy goes up, it can overwhelm that easily. And those things are ultimately rooted in consumption and the growth of population. That's Alan, maybe I'll see if there are any other questions there.
Well, and it might be interesting to see some of your examples where we are a lot better today than.
Sure. Okay, let me switch the slides back because these are encouraging. And one of my challenges in writing this is not to bum people out. My purpose is it's really for undergrads in environmental studies and people who are getting interested in these things for the first time to say, great, but be ready. You got to deal with these things. Otherwise, you're just going to get surprised by them and not be prepared. And so the logic is better be prepared than not be prepared. But I am, well, anybody teaching environmental studies has to worry about just getting people bummed out. Yeah. So, okay. So here, let me.
Laurie, did you have a point you wanted to make?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you could speak briefly on the latest gain, not necessarily latest gains, but effective responses, what things are on the horizon. I'm afraid I'm going to ask you, the audio cut out for a second there, and I might have missed a couple key words. Oh, I'm sorry. You had a section.
Not your fault if you just repeat the question, though.
Yeah, you had a section on effective responses, and I wondered if you could talk about what the future might hold.
You mean what would be effective, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
What things are on the horizon?
Okay, so those are, so what the future might hold and effective responses in general, I think whoever it was that said ultimately it comes down to values, I think Aldo Leopold, and there are other people who were written in broader context, like Martin Luther King, is right that ultimately, if we don't start to perceive these things broadly as ethical issues, it's going to be very hard to get to a point where, the way I look at, I mean, that real broadly speaking, indigenous societies that were still around for anthropologists from more industrialized societies to encounter them must have persisted, or they wouldn't have been there for anthropologists to encounter. That means by any kind of time frame that we can really grasp, they were sustainable societies. Now, there might have been some others that were non-sustainable that anthropologists never encountered because they weren't sustainable. But as a general rule, indigenous societies were sustainable. By sustainable, I don't mean it said it was sustainable on the side of a Twinkie. I mean that what they did could go on because it didn't destroy what it depended upon. I don't frankly think, I think an argument can be made, let me change this to a positive and non-negative statement. I think an argument can be made that no agricultural society, and therefore no industrial society, has been sustainable. Some have sustained for a long time, but the environment has been degraded, I think. And there's a fascinating book from the 50s called Topsoil and Civilization. If you can find it, you can find it on used book sites. It's just kind of daunting. That was Topsoil and Civilization. The authors are named Dale and Carter. One of them was an Oklahoma high school teacher. I can't remember which one. So ultimately, I think, there's a lot of things that are treated as ethical, like Aldo Leopold writes in The Land Ethic. There are a lot of things that are treated as ethical concerns now that were just purely utilitarian, what's in it for me concerns in the past. And I think that's got to happen ultimately. And frankly, when it does, people are going to go look back and say, how did Pete Schulze live his life? And I'm going to be canceled. Okay, because some things that that even we probably consider okay now are probably not going to be considered okay in the future. I used to drive my kids to Plano to play soccer games when they were like 12. And, you know, I was packing all the kids that there were seatbelts in a Toyota Prius, but still, this doesn't make any sense. You know, I know there's climate change. But it was socially, you know, I didn't want to tell the kids they couldn't play in the soccer games. So, but in the future, I don't think people are going to be driving 12-year-olds 50 miles in a gas-powered vehicle. Maybe they'll find another way to do it. Okay, so ultimately, I think the values have to shift. When it comes to what needs to happen in the short term, if that's the other kind of another part of your question, then I think a big piece of it is we got to quit being able to get away with essentially what these cars, and let's see, you're seeing this Los Angeles photo now, right? Because I was switching over to the things that have gotten better. Essentially, let me skip ahead a couple, actually, except for the way I've got the view going, it's tricky. Look at this. I'll try to stick with your question here. You see the slide that says city dump, Alan, just nod if you can see it.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. This was an official sign. I forgot to put the reference on here, but this is in a government document, a USGS document from the 60s. They weren't advocating this, but they were showing that this was a sign that some city in the US built. City dump at water's edge. We'll get the bulldozer and shove it into the river later. That's, you know, we don't do that anymore. But basically what was going on there was it was free to, you could have all these things you wanted and then just dump them in the river. Okay. And you got to throw them, you got to pollute the environment for free. And frankly, that's what these cars were doing. Everybody's sharing the cost of this stuff in the air, but the person driving this car is getting all the benefit of this car moving. So the way I try to explain this to students is, okay, I have this little Nissan Leaf now, but I also have a pickup truck, and because I set these fires out at the college property, I'm responsible for about a dozen internal combustion engines, if you count little tiny ones. And I used to tell students, look, I wouldn't have driven to campus today for this class if I had to route the exhaust pipe into the interior of the car and breathe that stuff myself, right? But so the dump at the reason I use the dump at the water's edge in this photo as examples is right now you see the dump at the water's edge one and probably think, cripes, that's ridiculous. And we can't see the greenhouse gas emissions coming out of our vehicles, but we're basically dumping into the atmosphere, like dumping into the atmosphere's edge, and it's free, but it's not really free. It's just we're not getting charged for it. And so economists would say that's a market failure, that somebody's getting something without paying for it, that's costing somebody else. And so regular economists would say that's not what should happen. You should have to pay. If you want to put that stuff in the atmosphere, you should have to pay to put it in the atmosphere. And that would be, frankly, like a carbon tax. Now, it's very hard to figure out how the carbon tax, how high it should be, and how to make it so it doesn't impact some people and basically be no impact on other people. But basically in the short, I mean, one of the things we can do in the short term is disincentivize damage in the environment by, at the very least, if we're not going to make it outlawed, at the very least, make people have to pay to do it, because that creates an incentive not to do it, which also creates an incentive for people to produce products that you can use instead that cause you to do whatever it was you wanted to do, like go from point A to point B, but without hurting the environment in the process. Does that somewhat answer the question? I mentioned these earlier. This is the concentration of carbon dioxide. This is just since 1980, and it went down a lot before 1980, but the EPA these are from EPA websites, and the EPA they changed a little bit how they display the data, how they collect the data. And so the data aren't directly comparable, but there's been a huge reduction since the Clean Air Act. Same with lead concentration in the atmosphere. But these things take time. Benjamin Franklin wrote about the problems with lead, but then lead wasn't taken out of gasoline until I'm trying to remember, 80s maybe in the US. Remember, some of you will remember when there were two kinds of pumps, leaded and unleaded. Look at this. I found this a while back. A friend of mine, Nate Bigelow in the political science department, sent me this. This was in Popular Science magazine as the recommended way of dealing with your used motor oil in an article called The Modern Garage, like Home Garage. And the magazine was kind enough to give me permission to put this in a book. And the point is to help students realize holy crap, we don't do that anymore. You know, so maybe we have actually wised up to a few things, but there are more things to be wised up to. You can't find.
I'd like to make a comment.
Please, Beverly.
Yeah, I think that you need to write a children's book and get it in the Texas, accepted for Texas as part of their curriculum.
I appreciate the suggestion. I'll my son didn't hear that. He'd probably go, oh no, it'll be boring. And but I appreciate that. I will say, and you know, and not to be like too much information, but when I didn't set out to write this book. I just been frustrating that so many people understand this, and we just stuck. And early on, I didn't know much about the politics of things. I mean, I knew kind of what anybody my age knew, but sorry, lost my train of thought.
Just do it.
You know, here's the point. Reviewers say, you got to give us more at the end about recommendations. And I'm like, wait a minute. It's one thing to recognize obstacles. It's another to know what to do about them. But every reviewer says this. And so the last thing I got to work on is what I have to recommend. And and in that set of things, and again, it's not rocket science. I mean, a lot of people would be able to come up with these recommendations, I think, but it has stuff to do with education. But I'm not an expert on what goes on in education at different grade levels at all, by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not an expert in practically anything that's in this draft. There's nothing about zooplankton in there, and that's about the only thing I could claim any expertise in any time for. So I will say, from my anecdotal observations, the very early ages, a lot of the teachers have more flexibility, and maybe it's just the classrooms I was invited into, but I mean, it was almost like environmental religion. I mean, it was like singing songs about the earth and stuff. But then as you get, and maybe some of you are teachers or have been teachers, and you'll know more about this than I do. When you start to get into middle school and high school, then environmental science becomes like the remedial science and doesn't get as much attention. I mention that just because I don't know if it's if this stuff became cool to middle schoolers and high schoolers, that would be very hopeful development. I think a lot of little kids, I don't know, but my experience is just so limited. But my kids' teachers, maybe it was just a chance. Some of the curriculum that they had that was like, wow, I'm surprised this has gotten through whoever's screening this in this state, because it was very green. But that was only in like the really low elementary grades. Alan, how we doing? It's a little past 11.
We're okay. I didn't realize that we once sold wallpaper with DDT in it.
Hey, I'm not old enough to remember them because they weren't around in my day, but there were these things called, I didn't put a slide in here, but fluoroscopes. It was trendy in shoe stores for a while to have an x-ray machine in a shoe store. You come in, the kid stands on this thing with their shoes on. The kid, the parent, and the shoe salesman all look in little ports and see the bones of the kid's foot. And I'm thinking, you got to take your shoes off to try shoes on anyway. Why do you need an x-ray of the bones? Those were routine for a while. They were called the fluoroscope. You can look it up, you find them. Also, if you look up Oak Ridge National Lab, it's like nuclear history collection or something like that. You could get radium bread, radium makeup, radium, sorry, but the one I remember is radium suppositories. The packages said something like, make worn out, depleted men vigorous again, radium suppositories, but these are examples that I have in my second chapter about things that we just accepted them, or somebody did, without any idea what they were doing, because there wasn't a skepticism about, wait, should we ask somebody about whether this is a good idea or not? So yeah, apparently, you know, if you were a good parent, you would have had DDT laced wallpaper back in the, that's a what does that say down there at the bottom? 1947 or something. Can't quite see it. Yeah, just prophylactically keep those mosquitoes out of that bedroom. Congress in early 60s, did anybody know that there was serious discussion about using nuclear weapons to blow a hole somewhere in West Texas to divert the salty tributaries to Lake Texoma? I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. The Corps of Engineers was budgeted by, you know, Congress, I guess, to create something called, literally it was called the Nuclear Cratering Group. And so Lake Texoma, you probably know, is somewhat salty. About half of the salt is oil-filled brine that has an exception from the Clean Water Act. And then about the other half is from a few tributaries that run through old salt deposits. And those, the Corps was interested in increase, and it's not a criticism of the Corps. I mean, this was back when nuclear power was going to be too cheap to meter and all that. Was interested in diverting the salty waters to keep Lake Texoma from being salty, so that the water would be higher quality, because Lake Texoma wasn't used as a water supply for a long time because it was so salty. And when we first moved into our house, there was a clog in the kitchen drain, and I went to take the drain apart, and it just came apart in my hand. It was metal. I learned since then. I'm on the west side of Sherman. We have Lake Texoma water. It's desalinated, but it's still salty. Anyhow, they literally, I've got a thing on outside my office that has the excerpt from the document. It says, you know, at this time we've evaluated the potential of blowing a freaking hole in the ground with a nuclear weapon and letting that river go into there instead of go to Lake Texoma, but we've decided not to do it. But Congress, in the early 60s, Congress budgeted, I think, $18 million for a group to evaluate whether to use nuclear weapons. They called it nuclear earth moving or something like that. Nuclear weapons to blow a equivalent of a second Panama Canal across Central America. And, you know, it has this very bureaucratic, and I don't use that word in a bad way, but bureaucratic. We've determined at this time this is not the most cost-effective option or something like that. Yeah, so I wonder what we're doing now that, you know, smartphones are crying out loud. You know, that's not necessarily an environmental thing, but it's a thing in terms of the unintended consequences.
Yeah, Pete,
Yes.
I remember growing up in Gainesville, at one point, they pumped water out of the Red River and let it flow down the Trinity to Dallas, so Dallas would have water.
Mm.
And 10 years later, they realized they were rusting out all the steel pipes in all of Dallas because of the salinity of the water they were pulling in.
Well, the thing in Flint a few years ago, I mean, this was basic water chemistry, but the folks who were completely focused on cutting costs didn't know any water chemistry and didn't know enough to ask an aquatic chemist, and cause lead, you know, to contaminate the entire Flint water system, as far as I could tell. It's tragic. But the reason I bring those things up in this draft is to say, look, we don't have does anybody here on the call here know anybody who, or have you ever heard of anybody who's paid to look out for problems that might occur that nobody's realized might occur? I don't know anybody paid to do that. I know that there are a few places that try to do that, but I don't know the people. You know, I know a lot of people that do this or that or the other thing, but I don't know anybody that does that. And yet we have global climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion. We dodge a bullet on that one. I think we dodged it. You know, but what's killing the insects? Is it neonic pesticides? Is it habitat destruction? Is it non-native species? I mean, we know we're passing non-native species around all over the place and hardly do anything to prevent it, as far as I can tell. We sometimes do things once they're there to try to get rid of them, but in terms of encumbering commerce to prevent the movement of non-native species, it hardly do anything. Don't mean to be depressing though, because remember, this was recommended when I was a kid, and these people decided to fix these, and they're fixed. Basically, they're not perfect, but they're fixed. And we would consider it absurd to do this now. So maybe our kids will consider it absurd to put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You know, it remains to be seen. It's going to depend on decisions people make. And my motivation for is these obstacles do exist, and I think my hope is that people don't encounter them as surprises. Oh shoot, this is going to be expensive, or oh, finally people agreed to do this, but we don't know how. But see them as a systematic set of things that you just have to get good at getting over. The way maybe a physician would go, okay, we've got a heart situation here. What are the options, and what do we have to worry about? And what's, be systematic about it and intentional. I appreciate everybody's attention. Because it's Zoom, you can do like some of my students, and you don't even have to be there anymore. So if you need to get going or something, I won't be offended if you sign off, but also Wayne would know, I suppose Wayne would know, at the end of a class in the last year and a half or so, it's kind of funny when the class ends and some students don't go away, and you think, are they asleep, or did they go away about 45 minutes ago?
Well, that sounds like a good note to finish on here, unless somebody has some last minute comments they want to make. I think this was interesting and caused me to stop and pause and think. So I appreciate you taking the time, Pete, to share some of your thoughts on this and kind of lead this conversation.
Well, I
Great
appreciate
job.
everybody. Pardon me, Alan, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it a lot. If you have questions for me, these are not things that I'm not an expert on. These things are just things I've thought about a lot. I may very well have overlooked something, but if you have questions or anything, I guess everybody can still see the chat. So my email is in the chat, or you can find me at Austin College pretty easily, or a variety of people on the call, I think, have my phone number too.
Okay.
Everybody.
Wayne or Susan, what do we have to look forward to for January, or in terms of the programs for our second Saturday?
We will have our new employee out at the refuge, Spencer, who will be talking about bluebirds.
Sounds great. Okay, with that, I'm gonna stop recording and stop the session. Appreciate everyone for joining us today.